Greetings. Welcome to the Great Simplification with Nate Higgins. No, sorry, you're not dealing with Nate Higgins today. You're with me. And so the reason for this is that I have been thinking about and reflecting on what we were talking about yesterday in relation to zombies in Western culture. And my I'm just thinking through it in real time today. And so I was rewatching what I'd shared and sort of trying to summarize the argument for myself and noticing certain inadequacies in what I shared and wanting to offer steps toward adding more. And so I'm just sort of going to dive in and say a few different things and see what I find, and then I'm going to be quoting from Jung and Eckhart to help me. And so I want to explore a little bit of there's a little bit of sacred numbers and sacred geometry in the sense of one and three are both feminine numbers, and um, two and four are masculine numbers. And in relation to um, four different ways of knowing, um, propositional and perspectival are going to be one and three, and procedural and participatory are going to be two and four. And I guess what I'm saying is that, um, the relations between propositional, procedural, and um, perspectival form a kind of trinity. I'm just getting the text so that it can help me. And so those levels, propositional, procedural, and perspectival. And so what we were sort of exploring, and I think what the authors are exploring in their essay, and in this as well, is certain existential vulnerabilities that come about when propositional and perspectival are emphasized at the expense of procedural and participatory. Um, So we might have access to a lot of truth and to a lot of presence, but we might lack power. We might lack narrative and meta narrative. We might lack the right story. We might lack purpose in the world. We might not know what to do. Um, and I think this corresponds also with not yet having access to genuine gnosis. Um, so I guess I'm wanting to say that um, propositional, procedural, and perspectival form a trinity of a certain kind, a triangle, and I think all three of them are required to get to the level of genuine transformative experience, and um, where two of them are overemphasized at the expense of one, namely procedural knowing, not knowing how, how do we do it? Um, that transformative experience is not going to be made available. Um, it does still push it back on me of like, okay, Sam, that's great, but like, how? And I'm working on that. And I think part of it is the symptomatology of the medium, where like if we're meeting online and we're just doing um, dialectic into dialogos, then um, we're still subject to, like, if we're not having a whole ecology of practices in a community of practitioners with a viable worldview, then we are still vulnerable in different ways. And one of the vulnerabilities is expressed in is realized in the form of the existential trap of nihilism that is described in the paper, where if we do not have the skill and the if we don't know how to get to know each other as real persons, if we're not in a real relationship in a real place, um, and if we don't know how to do real relationships in an online way yet, then when we drop in either online or in person to either propositional tyranny on the one hand or to shared presence at a perspectival level on the other hand, then we're still subject to nihilism. Um, yeah, and so I think reverting to Christianity is not going to help us. I think reverting to Gnosticism is not going to help us. I think reverting to the Greeks, I mean, that was the whole point of the Renaissance, for goodness sake. And the thing about the Renaissance is that it didn't work. It petered out in medievalism. Um, so I do not think it is um, an adequate prescription by any means. I think it is an important component of what we can, of how to move forwards. But I think, yeah, the transformative experience that comes about as a result of an exaptation of this symbolic function in our time occurs at the deepest level of who we are as living beings, toward the core of life. And that's messy. It's not rational. It's very much beneath the level of rationality. But rationality can properly attune and orient uh, to that process. Um, and that's important. So, yeah, so I think there is an existential inadequacy where we sort of, even if we have good facility with dropping into shared perspectival presence and we have all the truth that we could ask for, we have all the propositions we could want, um, we still don't know how, we still don't have the right stories or the right know-how to get us to the point of genuine transformative experience from self A to self B, as in, and that is exactly it. Like in the sense of aspirational development, there's a kind of like, hey, we need to bootstrap human consciousness to some kind of higher level than we have been at if we're going to survive the meta crisis kind of thing. That seems broadly true. And yes, we can avoid, doing the like there are traps all along the way there where like that's kind of what the Heaven's Gate cult were doing. Like we don't want to do the cult thing. And thanks to Jamie Wheal and a bunch of people, we can actually look at ethical cult building and how to do it properly. But there's also a need to recognize the reality and the gravity and the seriousness of the situation of, um, hey, this illusion of being separate creatures leads to the game theoretic dynamics, which are kind of at the core of what's wrong. And so, um, if we can allow digital interaction, for example, to um, bootstrap consciousness to the point where the we sense is a kind of baseline, that could be a way forwards. But this is all sort of gesturing still, and what I'm wanting to explore here is how the connection between. I'm going to make a couple of associations. So we were talking about how in these practices, in dialectic into dialogos, and in, for example, the book, there's a lot of propositional knowing which is present, and a lot of perspectival access to different perspective, in the sense of a shared third person we space, that is available, but it doesn't solve nihilism. Why? Well, it seems to dissolve personhood. It seems to affect our capacity to know ourselves as persons. And I think this is where our um, the Christian inheritance really comes through in the sense of um, offering ourselves to each other and making ourselves available. And what I'm intending to explore in this is how that helps. It's like what is the correspondence between um, first of all, I'm making a connection between that kind of agape or compassion, um, yeah, the love associated with personhood. What is the connection between that and procedural knowing? Because I'm saying that that's a part of how. Um, then I'm like, okay, what's the connection between that level or those two? What's the connection between procedural knowing and participatory knowing, or offering agape to each other in a relational sense, uh, and yeah, and transformative experience or gnosis. And Jung is going to help me to do that. Um, not least Eckhart as well. And so I might get into some of the quoting um, I'm wanting to do. I'm wanting to read extensively a few different pages. This is from Psychological Types, which is collected works number 6. And this is chapter 5, the type problem in poetry, and section B, which is the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart, which is I'm sort of extending the same theme that I was um, talking about in poetic terms yesterday by quoting from Jung, by quoting from the Upanishads and the Vedas, which is this correspondence between the Atman and Brahman, personhood and the divine. And we actually, um, I'll offer one other thing before I get into quoting, and that's that when I was listening back, there was a key quotation about the function of symbols, because the thing about symbols are going to show up and be quite important as they have been for John and in John's work, and um, they show up at the participatory level. So, in the sense that to the degree that it is true that God has been reborn and we are participating in the ongoing emergence of God, that is showing up first at a participatory and perspectival level. And in terms of language, it shows up first in symbolic form, um, internally and externally. Um, I'm just going to pause for editing to find the quote. I finally found it. It took me about an hour to say, and you can tell because the light is different, so it seems like 2 seconds, but it's not at all. What I wanted to quote two different things from this text. First of all, it was the part from page 17 where it's about zombies are untouchable, and it says our penchant for touch is ultimately what distinguishes intimate relationships from non-intimate ones. Not only relationships with people, but with animals, objects, concepts. The more in touch we are with something, the closer and more connected we are to that thing. Touch is the medium of intimacy. Without it, it's hard to imagine that intimacy could exist at all. However, intimacy is not the only casualty of the zombie's untouchableness. And what I said about that was that um, by extending the touch metaphor, as do the authors, we can see that we can in fact remain in touch with the zombie, despite and even because of our preference not to touch the zombie physically. And that fact is the basis of their evocative power as symbols. What this basically means is that, like, yes, the fact that we are cut off from each other by virtue of the digital medium, by virtue of the medium of text, and the fact that we're cut off from each other by the medium of the shared, uh, yeah, third person perspectival presence that we can drop into. We feel cut off from each other because our egos just sort of disappear, and it seems as if our personhood is tied to our ego, and it's not. And um, why? It's kind of like there's I'm saying that the okay, so the capacity of symbols to evoke, like we feel connected to symbols, right? And it's like we don't have to touch them, or like we're touched by symbols, metaphorically speaking, uh, which is what makes them symbols. And so, how do I articulate that? I'm not sure how to articulate that. Even in my speaking right now, like to the degree that I'm able to convey anything meaningful, is it not because of this symbolic power of speech to refer, to indicate meaning? And even um, even when we talk about material, which is difficult, and even like emotionally or whatever, or like even if we talk about a symbol, like yeah, the fact that the meaning crisis, the fact that the zombie is a symbol of the meaning crisis, and that it shows that we're in some way cut off from each other. Um, like actually, the power of the zombie to demonstrate that reveals that we are actually still in touch with symbols and with the zombie, qua zombie. But like most notably, zombies aren't real. It's a symbol. It's made up, right? It's a fiction. It's a fictionalization. So we actually can't go and touch a zombie because they don't exist. But the reason that we're spending so much time talking about it is because it can touch us. And that shows that the machinery that the meaning crisis is uh, supposedly undermining can be used to articulate that situation and to talk about it and to recover itself from the inside. So if we can uh, disclose to ourselves the the meaning, the true meaning of being able to talk about symbols, um, for example, like the zombie, that can actually that actually points to how to get out of the meaning crisis. Um, that was one thing I wanted to mention as well. One other quote, which I now recognize that I have lost. Let me find it. Found it. The quote was from page 15 at the bottom. We cannot see the mind of a zombie because they have no mind to see. The vacancy in a zombie's gaze provides a window to the absence of soul, which I said echoes and echoes. Yeah, so it's like if so soul is connected to personhood, and soul is also connected to um, transformative experience, and therefore participatory knowing, gnosis. And um, yeah, to the degree that we're lacking in soul, um, participating in nihilism at the perspectival or propositional level is going to reveal that. Um, but I think that the zombie actually is a symbol of anima mundi, the world soul. And I think our own individual souls are sort of facets of that jewel, if you like. And like if you imagine what it's like for a baby to be born. Or like, I speak from personal experience. So I grew up on a sheep and cattle farm, and part of the experience of growing up on a sheep and cattle farm is to assist birthing ewes, meaning EWES, like meaning sheep who are mothers, assisting them to give birth by sometimes physically pulling a lamb from the from a ewe, and it's messy. It's like it's full on, and that is what is happening to humanity. This is the we're giving birth to ourselves, and it's messy, right? And the zombie is a symbol of that. And that's what I'm saying is that in some way there's a way I'm still thinking this through, right? So these are speculative thoughts, and we can take them or leave them. But the emergence of this in no time flat, it ate all of the technology, and now it's just here all the time, right next to us. Um, and I'm this is another version of it, right? We're talking through it right now. Um, this is in some way a black mirror. It's a reflective screen, and it is in some way a crystal ball or a looking glass, and it reveals, in the sense of AI, it reveals the dark underbelly. This is Tristan Harris and Jonathan Haidt. It reveals the lowest angels of our nature to ourselves. It exposes the dark underbelly of humanity, and that's a sort of we're being dragged kicking and screaming. But that's what it like. That's why a bootstrapping process is to pull oneself up by one's feet, and that looks like the feet are dirty. And the the zombie is a symbol of that, just as much as it is a symbol of everything that's going wrong. Um, and I guess what I'm connecting here is that I'm ultimately hoping that everything that I can say is going to converge. I'm circumambulating around something unnameable in everything that I'm saying. And I think why would I say that? Um, because the symbol of the zombie can contribute to that. Um, just as much as it can contribute to articulating everything that's going wrong, it can contribute to the our transformation. And I will say more about that in time. I as I explore it. But the point about the soul is that um, this is the whole thing about Jung and John Viveki is that like we've learned through this is about Charles Stang and the divine double and John's relationship with Hermes and Socrates' relationship with his daemon and Jung's relationship with what he called anima or soul is that um, this relationship is critical in facilitating transformative experience. Um, it's the soul as a guide. So um, so what am I saying about that? I'm much more encouraged by like I said, we were kind of doing a debriding, and that I felt that the authors were participating in nihilism, but also participating in what's next. And part of participating in what's next is building a relationship with one soul, or with Hermes, as the case may be, with a daemon. And why? Um, because it allows one to clarify the it's sort of in the finitude and transcendence Drew Highland thing of it allows one to clarify the one's own personhood and to construct a meta narrative or a story narrative identity about oneself that can bridge the gap between finitude and transcendence or between Atman and Brahman, between self one and self two. And yeah, that's definitely that's a bit more of how, like in the sense of hey Sam, like great way of pointing out the inadequacies of propositional tyranny and submerging oneself in nihilism in the third person perspectival presence. But you just said that we need more Christian agape and compassion to solve it. Like that seems like weak sauce because you said that a reversion to Christianity was the wrong way. So what else is the right way? Like you're offering an inadequate solution, and I'm like, yes, very well noticed, and um, definitely getting to know each other as persons. So making ourselves knowable, making ourselves available, and even decanting ourselves potentially online. That might be part of it, although the questions about transparency and privacy then obviously show up. But um, knowing how, in the sense of what's next, is not only knowing us, being available as persons and knowing ourselves as persons, but constructing a meta narrative that can bridge the gap between procedural and participatory, between self one and self two, between finitude and transcendence, and what. And yeah, that's not exactly a rational. I mean, it can be rational, but I'm getting at it. I'm partly trying to. mm, mm, There's a way in which symbols are going to be really important. That doesn't say anything. So how can I articulate this? I'm going to leave behind this and draw from Jung and Eckhart in the hopes that that will provoke the insight which I am seeking. I think we're being given an opportunity to clarify who we are. Who are we? As McKenna said, like the history of this, the silly monkey is over one way or another. So this is kind of, are we doing the transcendence thing? Are we bootstrapping to a high level of consciousness in some way so that we can continue to live? Or are we exiting this ride? And it will probably depend on whether we can use the symbol forming function to construct a meta narrative of who we are that bridges between finite and transcendence in such a way that allows us to access gnosis. and transformative experience. And it will require us to get our propositions and our procedures and our perspectives all aligned towards participating in that. And only when we have all, like, what I'm saying partly with that Trinity thing of like propositional, procedural, and perspectival is that if you have two of them but not the third one, there are going to be vulnerabilities or inadequacies that show up. And that this expresses, and the essay, the 2024 essay that I mentioned, express some of the inadequacies of having access to the perspectival but not enough of the interrelational stuff. Yep. Um, I think it's important that God said that like God was reborn in the soul, and this is what Eckhart's about to say. So I'm going to quote from Jung, and um, it's interesting. So let's see what Jung has to say. I want to read for a bit, and then I'll stop at different points if I feel like it. This is page 241 of Psychological Types, Part B, the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart. And Jung was talking about the symbolism of the vessel. So this is a feminine symbol, the symbolism of the Holy Grail of the the vessel, the vessel of wisdom. He was talking about the origins of Gnosticism, and I won't go on about it, but just to say it's the feminine symbolism that's associated with uh, numbers 1 and 3, or with propositional and perspectival. Yeah, and with the void. This is feminine symbolism. Um, that's he was talking about the void and about the vessel. And so um, the process of transformation which Hermas experienced represents on a small scale what took place on a large scale in the early medieval psychology. A new revelation of woman and the development of the feminine symbol of the Grail. Hermas saw Rhoda in a new light, and the libido, thus set free, transformed itself under his hands into the fulfillment of his social task. It is, I think, characteristic of our psychology that we find on the threshold of the new age two figures who are destined to exert an immense influence on the hearts and minds of the younger generation. Wagner, the prophet of love, whose music runs the whole gamut of feeling, from Tristan down to incestuous passion, and then up again from Tristan to the sublime spirituality of Parsifal. And Nietzsche, the prophet of power and of the triumphant will for individuality. It gets more interesting in a bit, but we just I want to be thorough. Wagner, in his last and loftiest utterance, harked back to the Grail legend, as Goethe did to Dante, but Nietzsche seized on the idea of a master caste and a master morality, an idea embodied in many a fair-haired hero and knight of the Middle Ages. Wagner broke the bonds that fettered love. Nietzsche shattered the tables of values that cramp individuality. Both strove after similar goals, while at the same time creating irremediable discord. For where love is, power cannot prevail, and where power prevails, love cannot reign. The fact that three of the greatest minds of Germany should fasten on early medieval psychology in their most important works is proof, it seems to me, that that age has left behind a question which still remains to be answered. It may be well, therefore, to examine this question a little more closely. I have the impression that the mysterious something that inspired the knightly orders, the Templars, for instance, and that seems to have found expression in the Grail legend, may possibly have been the germ of a new orientation to life. In other words, a nascent symbol. The non-Christian or Gnostic character of the Grail symbol takes us back to the early Christian heresies, those germinating points in which a whole world of audacious and brilliant ideas lay hidden. In Gnosticism, we see man's unconscious psychology in full flower, almost perverse in its luxuriance. It contained the very thing that most strongly resisted the regula fide, that Promethean and creative spirit which will bow only to the individual soul and to no collective ruling. Although in crude form, we find in Gnosticism what was lacking in the centuries that followed, a belief in the efficacy of individual revelation and individual knowledge. This belief was rooted in the proud feeling of man's affinity with the gods, subject to no human law, and so overmastering that it may even subdue the gods by the sheer power of gnosis. In gnosis are to be found the beginnings of the path that led to the intuitions of German mysticism, so important psychologically, which came to flower at the time of which we're speaking. interlude to say that I'm conscious of the criticisms of Gnosticism, and I'm not necessarily prescribing Gnosticism. I'm saying that the feminine symbolism associated with uh, the Grail, the vessel, was connected with Sophia and was connected with ended up in being connected with Mary, and that the um, Christian repression of the worship of the woman, as Jung is pointing to, was critical in the devaluation of the human soul and to the origins of the meaning crisis in which we're embedded. And that it was, I mean, yeah, reestablishing our relationship with soul or with a daemon, whatever internal, whatever's going on with you, really, um, facilitates the capacity for transformation, for the capacity for gnosis. And we don't have to believe in Gnosticism. We don't have to subscribe to Gnosticism to understand that and to participate in it. The question now before us focuses our attention on the greatest thinker of that age, Meister Eckhart. Just as signs of a new orientation are apparent in chivalry, so in Eckhart we are confronted with new ideas, ideas having the same psychic orientation that impelled Dante to follow the image of Beatrice into the underworld of the unconscious, and that inspired the singers who sang the lore of the Grail. Nothing is known, unfortunately, of Eckhart's personal life that would explain how he was led to his knowledge of the soul. The meditative air with which he says in his discourse on repentance, and still today one seldom finds that people come to great things without they first go somewhat astray, permits the inference that he wrote from personal experience. Strangely appealing is Eckhart's sense of an inner affinity with God when contrasted with the Christian sense of sin. We feel ourselves transported back into the spacious atmosphere of the Upanishads. Eckhart must have experienced a quite extraordinary enhancement of the value of the soul, i.e., of his own inner being, that enabled him to rise to a purely psychological and relativistic conception of God and of his relation to man. This discovery and painstaking exposition of the relativity of God to man and the soul seemed to me one of the most important landmarks on the way to a psychological understanding of religious phenomena, serving at the same time to liberate the religious function from the cramping limitations of intellectual criticism, though this criticism, of course, must not be denied its dues. We now come to the main theme of this chapter, the relativity of the symbol. The relativity of God, as I understand it, denotes a point of view that does not conceive of God as absolute, i.e., wholly cut off from man and existing outside and beyond all human qualities, but as in a certain sense dependent on him. It also implies a reciprocal and essential relation between man and God, whereby man can be understood as a function of God, and God is a psychological function of man. From the empirical standpoint of analytical psychology, the God image is the symbolic expression of a particular psychic state or function, which is characterized by its absolute ascendancy over the will of the subject, and can therefore bring about or enforce actions and achievements that could never be done by conscious effort. This overpowering impetus to action, so far as the God function manifests itself in acts, or this inspiration that transcends conscious understanding, has its source in an accumulation of energy in the unconscious. The accumulated libido activates images lying dormant in the collective unconscious, among them the God image, that engram or imprint which from the beginning of time has been the collective expression of the most overwhelmingly powerful influences exerted on the conscious mind by unconscious concentrations of libido. Hence, for our psychology, which as a science must confine itself to empirical data within the limits set by cognition, God is not even relative, but a function of the unconscious, the manifestation of a dissociated quantum of libido that's activated the God image. From the metaphysical point of view, God is, of course, absolute, existing in himself. This implies his complete detachment from the unconscious, which means psychologically a complete unawareness of the fact that God's action springs from one's own inner being. A complete unawareness of the fact that God's action springs from one's own inner being. The relativity of God, on the other hand, means that a not inconsiderable portion of the unconscious processes is registered, at least indirectly, as a psychological content. Naturally, this insight is possible only when more attention than usual is paid to the psyche, with the consequence that the contents of the unconscious are withdrawn from projection into objects and become endowed with a conscious quality that makes them appear as belonging to the subject and are subjectively conditioned. This is what happened with the mystics, though it was not the first time that the idea of God's relativity had appeared. It's found in principle and in the very nature of things among primitives. Almost everywhere on the lower human levels, the idea of God has a purely dynamic character. God is a divine force, a power related to health, to the soul, to medicine, to riches, to the chief, a power that can be captured by certain procedures and employed for the making of things needful for, I'm sorry, but like a power that can be captured by certain procedures and employed for the making of things needful for the life of well-being of man, and also to produce magical or baneful effects. And you know what? Like, there's quite a few things that are needful for the life and well-being of man at this present point in time. And to quote what he was saying about the Upanishads, which we can then accept, um, pausing while I find it, he said earlier that um, on the transcendent function, since the middle position as a function of mediation between the opposites possesses an irrational character and is still unconscious, it appears projected in the form of a mediating God, a Messiah. In our more primitive Western forms of religion, primitive because lacking insight, the new bearer of life appears as a God or Savior who, in his fatherly love and solicitude, or from his own inner resolve, puts an end to the division as and when it suits him, and for reasons we're not fitted to understand. The childishness of this conception needs no stressing. The East has for thousands of years been familiar with this process and has founded on it a psychological doctrine of salvation, which brings the way of deliverance within man's ken and capacity. Thus, the religions of India and China, and particularly Buddhism, which combines the spheres of both, possess the idea of a redemptive middle way of magical efficacy, which is attainable by means of a conscious attitude. That's what we're exploring here, and that's exactly what we need, right? Um, in the sense that, yeah, if we're really going to pull that off, if we're really going to recognize that we need to sort of exact the symbolic function to do the equivalent of discovering language for the first time in order to bootstrap human consciousness to a baseline level of we're all one, let's say, something like that, in order to survive um, circa the situation, in order to do all that, then we would have to, in Jungian terms, sort of withdraw the the libido from objects, as in, and introject that libido so that the symbol forming function could be given free rein, which he's saying happens in mysticism. Um, yeah, um, because not, when one is not in mysticism, there's a sort of complete unawareness of the fact that God's action springs from one's own inner being. Um, the relativity of God, on the other hand, means that a not inconsiderable portion of the unconscious processes is registered, at least indirectly, as a psychological content. Naturally, this insight is possible only when more attention than usual is paid to the psyche, with the consequence that the contents of the unconscious are withdrawn from projection into objects and become endowed with a conscious quality that makes them appear as belonging to the subject and as subjectively conditioned. This was what happened with the mystics, though it was not the first time that the idea of God's relativity had appeared. So I guess what I'm then going to say is that it seems that the I think the response to the situation is a collective response, and that we have to somehow get out of our own way so that the power or force capable of responding to the meta crisis is actually capable of responding. And I think that um, that is actually either what is going on already or going to be going on, and that listening to whatever demonic relationship we've created within our own inner life is going to be a crucial feature of that, because I think it's from our soul, so to speak, that the way forward is going to emerge or arise. And whether it's symbols that come through or and the equivalent of discovering language. I don't know what that would look like right now, but I have some thoughts because, as I said, all of what I'm saying circumambulates around one thing, which is also a process, um, in the sense that the symbolic power of Christ was his life. It was who he was. Um, what did I mean by that? It's the most obvious connection between who he was as a person and his symbolic power. Like there's a connection between personhood and procedural knowing at that level and participatory knowing and, and transformative experience and symbolic power. Okay, continuing because I want to get to Eckhart because they it demonstrates the same the thrust of the same argument that I'm attempting to. It's not an argument, for God's sake. Um, this is what happened with the mystics, though it was not the first time that the idea of God's relativity had appeared. It's found, yeah, uh, it's found in principle and in the very nature of things among primitives. Almost everywhere on the lower human levels, the idea of God has a purely dynamic character. God is a divine force, a power related to health, to the soul, to medicine, to riches, to the chief, a power that can be captured by certain procedures and employed for the making of things needful for the life and well-being of man, and also to produce magical or baneful effects. The primitive feels this power as much within him as outside him. It is as much his own life force as it is the medicine in his amulet or the mana emanating from his chief. Here we have the first demonstrable conception of an all-pervading spiritual force. Psychologically, the efficacy of the fetish or the prestige of the medicine man is an unconscious subjective evaluation of those objects. Their power resides in the libido, which is present in the subject's unconscious, and it is perceived in the object because whenever unconscious contents are activated, they appear in projected form. The relativity of God in medieval mysticism is therefore a regression to a primitive condition. In contrast, the related Eastern conceptions of the individual and supra-individual Atman are not so much a regression to the primitive as a continuous development out of the primitive in a typically Eastern way that still manages to preserve the efficacy of the primitive principle. The regression to the primitive is not surprising in view of the fact that every vital form of religion organizes one or the other primitive tendency in its ceremonials or its ethics, thereby securing for itself those secret instinctive forces that conduce to the perfecting of human nature in the religious process. This reversion to the primitive, or as in India, the uninterrupted connection with it, keeps man in touch with Mother Earth, the prime source of all power. Seen from the heights of a differentiated point of view, whether rational or ethical, these instinctive forces are impure, but life itself flows from springs, both clear and muddy. Hence, all excessive purity lacks vitality. A constant striving for clarity and differentiation means a proportionate loss of vital intensity, precisely because the muddy elements are excluded. Every renewal of life needs the muddy as well as the clear. This was evidently perceived by the great relativist Meister Eckhart when he said, "For this reason, God is willing to bear the brunt of sins, and often winks at them, mostly sending them to those whom he has destined for great things. Behold, who was dearer and nearer to our Lord than the apostles? Not one of them but fell into mortal sin. All were mortal sinners. In the Old Testament and in the New, he's shown this to be true of those who afterwards were far the dearest to him. And still today, one seldom finds that people come to great things without they first go somewhat astray. Both on account of his psychological perspicacity and his deep religious feeling and thought, Meister Eckhart was the most brilliant exponent of that critical movement within the church, which began towards the end of the 13th century. I would like to quote a few of his sayings to illustrate his relativistic concept of God. Before he does that, I'm just going to say that on this tendency to um, project into messianic form, which we already saw, this is why the Christian solution is not adequate because we don't need to worship Christ. We need to be Christ. We need to follow his example. And I mean, certainly it takes me back to Elaine Pagels and the Gospel of Thomas, but not to the church fathers, not to the Catholic Church, um, who the pedestalizing of like we worship him and he's over there and we're not like him was important to the hierarchy and authority of the church. Um, yeah, so there's a realizing of Christianity, but not a reversion to the dogmatic beliefs, which end up actually foreclosing that realization to a degree. Anyway, Jung goes on, quoting from Eckhart, and this is what I'm attempting to evoke here is this correspondence between um, personhood and godhood, or Atman and Brahman, which is, and it's the symbolic function which can serve to help us recreate a meta narrative that is sufficiently binding between those levels that facilitates transformative experience, like at the appropriate scale and level, which is exactly what was expressed in the Upanishads and the Vedas and in the Eastern religions. And I'm going to keep quoting. For man is truly God, and God is truly man. This is Eckhart. Whereas he who has not God as such an inner possession, whereas he who has not God as such an inner possession, but with every means must fetch him from without, in this thing or in that, where he is then sought for in vain, in all manner of works, people or places. Verily such a man has him not, and easily something comes to trouble him. And it is not only evil company that troubles him, but also the good, not only the street, but also the church, not only vile words and deeds, but the good as well. But the hindrance lies within himself, because in him God has not yet become the world, because in him God has not yet become the world. Were God that to him, then all would be well and good with him in every place, and with all people always possessing God. This is Jung, this passage is of particular psychological interest, as it exemplifies something of the primitive idea of God outlined above. Fetching God from without is the equivalent of the primitive view that Tondi can be got from outside. With Eckhart, it may be merely a figure of speech, but the original meaning nevertheless glimmers through. At any rate, it is clear that Eckhart understands God as a psychological value. This is proved by the words, and easily something comes to trouble him. For when God is outside, he is necessarily projected into objects, with the result that all objects acquire a surplus value. But whenever this happens, the object exerts an overpowering influence over the subject, holding him in slavish dependence. Eckhart is evidently referring to the subjection to the object, which makes the world appear in the role of God, i.e., as an absolutely determining factor. Hence, he says that for such a person, God has not yet become the world, since for him the world has taken the place of God. That part's a bit confusing, but anyway, the subject has not just succeeded in detaching and introverting the surplus value from the object, thus turning it into an inner possession. Were he to possess it in himself, he would have God, the same value, continually as an object, so that God would have become the world. In the same passage, Eckhart says, he that is right in his feeling is right in any place and in any company. But if he is wrong, he finds nothing right, wherever or with whom he may be. For a man of right feeling has God with him. A man who has this value in himself is everywhere at ease. He is not dependent on objects, not forever needing and hoping to get from the object what he lacks himself. From all this, it should be sufficiently clear that for Eckhart, God is a psychological, or to be more accurate, a psychodynamic state. And just to mention in passing that, like, as per my commentary on the Red Book introduction, I'm not endorsing Jung as a psychologist here, I'm actually endorsing Jung as a metaphysician in the sense that it was through Jung's dialogues with his soul that Jung came to the conclusion that God was being reborn. And it's that process which I'm attempting to indicate that we can continue in a rational but not regressive way, meaning without, like, we need to recognize that there's something of value in Gnosticism, there's something of value from the ancient Greeks, and there's something of value from Christianity as three main things, to say nothing of Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism and all the other religions that are relevant, and to say nothing of science, for example. But um, there's also something fundamentally new about our situation that requires genuine innovation and requires us to focus our awareness on the need to exact the symbolic forming capacity of humanity, in the sense of we kind of all need to be speaking the one language to a degree. And I don't want to be totalizing and centralizing, but it is our symbolizing power that gives us access, I think, to the transformative experience or shared gnosis that I think we need. Anyway, this is all, it's still metaphor at this point. So from Eckhart, by this kingdom of God we understand the soul, for the soul is of like nature with the Godhead. Hence, all that has been said here of the kingdom of God, how God is himself the kingdom, may be said with equal truth of the soul. St. John says, all things were made by him. This is to be understood of the soul, for the soul is all things. The soul is all things because she is an image of God, and as such she is also the kingdom of God. So much, says one master, is God in the soul, that his whole divine nature depends on her. It is a higher state for God to be in the soul than for the soul to be in God. The soul is not blissful because she is in God. She is blissful because God is in her. Rely upon it, God himself is blissful in the soul. That part is just about sort of ordering. So if you imagine that the numinous manifests through the soul, well, in some sense, the soul is how we appear from the point of view of the numinous. And so it's sort of like there's a sort of, it's psychodynamically healthier in some way to conceive of God within or through the soul, um, meaning that if we or the soul is sort of equivalent to daemon in this context. Okay, so um, I'm using those terms interchangeably for the time being. If you know, so like if so, the divine or the transcendent speaks to us and acts through us through the vessel of the soul, and I think both are true in the sense that from the other point of view, well, everything is in God, so that's also true. So the soul is in God, but there's a way that um, symbolically speaking, if you imagine Jung's symbol of the self as like the circle with the dot in the middle, well, it's just like which of them is the soul and which of them is God? Well, it's both because um, as we travel through the wormhole of time, um, um, what like the soul is an aperture by which we can access God, but God is also. I said that yeah, the soul is an aperture by which we can access God, um, but from the other point of view, I can't pull that off. It's something about them being like from different points of view. Either the circumference or the dot is the soul or is God. But basically, both soul is in God and God is in the soul, and it's important to be able to access the felt sense of both. Anyway, moving on. We only have a couple of pages more, but I'm going to keep going. because it's relevant, it applies. So this is Jung, looked at historically, the soul, that many-faceted and much interpreted concept, refers to a psychological content that must possess a certain measure of autonomy within the limits of consciousness. It's by virtue of the soul that we can attain to freedom from our situation, from our fate. If this were not so, man would never have hit on the idea of attributing an independent existence to his soul, as though it were some objectively perceptible thing. It must be a content in which spontaneity is inherent, and hence also partially unconsciousness, as with every autonomous complex. The primitive, as we know, usually has several souls, several autonomous complexes, with a high degree of spontaneity, so that they appear as having a separate existence, as in certain mental disorders. On a higher level, the number of souls decreases, until at the highest level of culture, the soul resolves itself into the subject's general awareness of his psychic activities, and exists only as a term for the totality of psychic processes. This absorption of the soul into consciousness is just as much a characteristic of Eastern as it is of Western culture. In Buddhism, everything is dissolved into consciousness. Even the samskaras, the unconscious formative forces, must be transformed through religious self-development. As against this historical evolution of the idea of the soul, analytical psychology opposes the view that the soul does not coincide with the totality of the psychic functions. We define the soul, on the one hand, as the relation to the unconscious, and on the other, as a personification of unconscious contents. From the civilized standpoint, it may seem deplorable that personifications of unconscious contents still exist, just as a man with a differentiated consciousness might well lament the existence of contents that are still unconscious. But since analytical psychology is concerned with man as he is and not with man as he would like to be, we have to admit that those same phenomena which impel the primitive to speak of souls still go on happening, just as there are still countless people among civilized nations who believe in ghosts. We may believe as much as we please in the doctrine of the unity of the ego, according to which there can be no such things as autonomous complexes, but nature herself does not bother in the least about our abstract theories. If the soul is a personification of unconscious contents, then according to our previous definition, God too is an unconscious content, a personification insofar as he is thought of as personal, and an image or expression of something insofar as he is thought of as dynamic. God and the soul are essentially the same when regarded as personifications of an unconscious content. Meister Eckhart's view, therefore, is purely psychological. So long as the soul, he says, is only in God, she is not blissful. If by blissful one understands a state of intense vitality, it follows from the passage quoted earlier that this state does not exist so long as the dynamic principle God, the libido, is projected upon objects. For so long as God, the highest value, is not in the soul, it is somewhere outside. God must be withdrawn from objects and brought into the soul, and this is a higher state in which God himself is blissful. Psychologically, this means that when the libido invested in God, i.e., the surplus value that is being projected, is recognized as a projection, the object loses its overpowering significance, and the surplus value consequently accrues to the individual, giving rise to a feeling of intense vitality, a new potential. God, life at its most intense, then resides in the soul, in the unconscious. But this does not mean that God has become completely unconscious, in the sense that all idea of him vanishes from consciousness. It's as though the supreme value was shifted elsewhere, so that it's now found inside and not outside. Objects are no longer autonomous factors, but God has become an autonomous psychic complex. An autonomous complex, however, is always only partially conscious, since it is associated with the ego only in limited degree, and never to such an extent that the ego could wholly comprehend it, in which case it would no longer be autonomous. Hence, the determining factor is no longer the overvalued object, but the unconscious. The determining influences are now felt as coming from within oneself, and this feeling produces a oneness of being, a relation between conscious and unconscious, in which, of course, the unconscious predominates. We must now ask ourselves whence comes this blissful feeling, this ecstasy of love, in this Brahman-like state of ananda, with the supreme value lying in the unconscious. There is a drop in the conscious potential. The unconscious becomes the determining factor, and the ego almost entirely disappears. It is a state strongly reminiscent of that of the child on the one hand, and of the primitive on the other, who is likewise influenced in the highest degree by the unconscious. We can safely say that the restoration of the earlier paradisal state is the cause of this blissfulness. But we have still to find out why this original state is so peculiarly blissful. The feeling of bliss accompanies all those moments when one feels borne along by the current of life, flow states, when what was dammed up can flow off without restraint, when there is no need to do this thing or that thing with a conscious effort or in order to find a way out or to achieve a result. We've all known situations or moods when things go of themselves, when we no longer need to manufacture all sorts of wearisome conditions for our joy or pleasure. The time of childhood is the unforgettable emblem of this joy, which, unperturbed by things without, pours in a warm flood from within. Childlikeness is therefore a symbol of that unique inner condition on which blissfulness depends. To be like a child means to possess a treasury of accumulated libido which can constantly stream forth. The libido of the child flows into things. In this way, he gains the world, then by degrees loses himself in the world, to use the language of religion, through a gradual overvaluation of things. The growing dependence on things entails the necessity of sacrifice, i.e., the withdrawal of libido, the severance of ties. The intuitive teachings of religion seek by this means to gather the energy together again. Indeed, religion portrays this process of recollection in its symbols. Actually, the overvaluation of the object as compared with the low value of the subject produces a retrograde current that would bring the libido quite naturally back to the subject, were it not for the obstructing power of consciousness. Everywhere among primitives we find religious practice harmonizing with nature, because the primitive is able to follow his instinct without difficulty, now in one direction and now in another. His religious practices enable him to recreate the magical power he needs. His religious practices enable him to recreate the magical power he needs, or to recover the soul that was lost to him during the night. The aim of the great religions is expressed in the injunction, not of this world, and this implies the inward movement of libido into the unconscious. Its withdrawal and introversion create in the unconscious a concentration of libido, which is symbolized as the treasure, as in the parables of the pearl of great price and the treasure in the field. Eckhart interprets the latter, the treasure in the field, as follows. Christ says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hid in a field. This field is the soul, wherein lies hidden the treasure of the divine kingdom. In the soul, therefore, are God and all creatures blessed." This interpretation agrees, this is Jung, this interpretation agrees with our psychological argument. The soul is a personification of the unconscious, where lies the treasure, the libido which is immersed in introversion and is allegorized as God's kingdom. This amounts to a permanent union with God and living in his kingdom, in that state where a preponderance of libido lies in the unconscious and determines conscious life. The libido concentrated in the unconscious was formerly invested in objects, and this made the world seem all-powerful. God was then outside, but now he works from within. Has the hidden treasure conceived as God's kingdom. If then Eckhart reaches the conclusion that the soul is itself God's kingdom, it's conceived as a function of relation to God, and God would be the power working within the soul and perceived by it. Eckhart even calls the soul the image of God. It's evident from the ethnological and historical material that the soul is a content that belongs partly to the subject and partly to the world of spirits, i.e., the unconscious. Hence, the soul always has an earthly as well as a rather ghostly quality. It is the same with magical power, the divine force of primitives, whereas on the higher levels of culture, God is entirely separate from man and is exalted to the heights of pure ideality. But the soul never loses its intermediate position. It must therefore be regarded as a function of relation between the subject and the inaccessible depths of the unconscious. The determining force, God, operating from these depths, is reflected by the soul. That is, it creates symbols and images, and is itself only an image. By means of these images, the soul conveys the forces of the unconscious to consciousness. It is both receiver and transmitter, an organ for perceiving unconscious contents. What it perceives are symbols, but symbols are shaped energies, determining ideas whose affective power is just as great as their spiritual value. When, says Eckhart, the soul is in God, is not it is not blissful. For when this organ of perception is overwhelmed by the divine dynamis, it is by no means a happy state. But when God is in the soul, i.e., when the soul becomes a vessel for the unconscious and makes itself an image or symbol of it, this is a truly happy state. The happy state is a creative state, as we see from the following noble words. Eckhart. If any should ask me, wherefore do we pray? Wherefore do we fast? Wherefore do we do all manner of good works? Wherefore are we baptized? Wherefore did God become man? I would answer, so that God may be born in the soul, and the soul again in God. Therefore were the Holy Scriptures written. Therefore did God create the whole world, that God might be born in the soul, and the soul again in God. The innermost nature of all grain is wheat, and of all metal, gold, and of all birth, man. And Jung. Here Eckhart states bluntly that God is dependent on the soul, and at the same time that the soul is the birthplace of God. This latter sentence can readily be understood in the light of our previous reflections. The organ of perception, the soul, apprehends the contents of the unconscious, and as the creative function gives birth to its dynamis in the form of a symbol. Again, the organ of perception, the soul, apprehends the contents of the unconscious, and as the creative function gives birth to its dynamis in the form of a symbol. The soul gives birth to images that, from the rational standpoint of consciousness, are assumed to be worthless. And so they are, in the sense that they cannot immediately be turned to account in the objective world. The first possibility of making use of them is artistic, if one is in any way gifted in that direction. A second is philosophical speculation. A third is quasi-religious, leading to heresy and the founding of sects. And a fourth way is employing the dynamis of these images is to squander it in every form of licentiousness. As we noticed at the beginning, the latter two modes of application were especially apparent in the encratic, ascetic, and antitactic, anarchic schools of Gnosticism. A little bit more. The conscious realization of these images is, however, of indirect value from the point of view of adaptation to reality, in that one's relation to the surrounding world is thereby freed from admixtures of fantasy. Nevertheless, their main value lies in promoting the subject's happiness and well-being, irrespective of external circumstances. To be adapted is certainly an ideal, but adaptation is not always possible. There are situations in which the only adaptation is patient endurance. This form of passive adaptation is made easier by an elaboration of the fantasy images. I say elaboration because at first the fantasies are merely raw material of doubtful value. They have to be worked on and put in a form best calculated to yield the maximum benefit. This is a matter of technique, which it would not be appropriate to discuss here. I will only say for clarity's sake that there are two methods of treatment. One, the reductive, and two, the synthetic. The former, the reductive, traces everything back to primitive instincts. The latter, the synthetic, develops the material into a process for differentiating the personality. The two methods are complementary, for reduction to instinct leads back to reality, indeed to an overvaluation of reality, and hence to the necessity of sacrifice. The synthetic method elaborates the symbolic fantasies resulting from the introversion of libido through sacrifice. This produces a new attitude to the world, whose very difference offers a new potential. I have termed this transition to a new attitude the transcendent function. In the regenerated attitude, the libido that was formerly sunk in the unconscious emerges in the form of some positive achievement. It is equivalent to a renewal of life, which Eckhart symbolizes by God's birth. Conversely, When the libido is withdrawn from external objects and sinks into the unconscious, the soul is born again in God. This state, as he rightly observes, is not a blissful one, because it is a negative act, a turning away from life, and a descent into the Deus abscondus, who possesses qualities very different from those of the God who shines by day. Eckhart speaks of God's birth as a continual process. As a matter of fact, the process in question is a psychological one that unconsciously repeats itself almost continually, though we are conscious of it only when it swings towards the extreme. Goethe's idea of a systole and diastole seems to have hit the mark intuitively. It may well be a question of a vital rhythm, of fluctuations of vital forces, which as a rule go on unconsciously. This may also explain why the existing terminology for such a process is in the main either religious or mythological, since these formulas refer primarily to unconscious psychological facts and not, as the scientific interpreters of myths often assert, to the phases of the moon or other meteorological phenomena. And because it is preeminently a question of unconscious processes, we have the greatest difficulty as scientists in extricating ourselves, at least so far, from the language of metaphor, as to reach the level of metaphor used by other sciences. Reverence for the great mysteries of nature, which the language of religion seeks to express in symbols hallowed by their antiquity, profound significance, and beauty, will not suffer from the extension of psychology to this domain, to which science has hitherto found no access. We only shift the symbols back a bit, shedding a little light on their darker reaches, but without succumbing to the erroneous notion that we have created anything more than merely a new symbol for the same enigma that perplexed all ages before us. Our science is a language of metaphor too, but in practice it works better than the old mythological hypothesis, which used concretisms as a means of expression, and not, as we do, concepts. As Eckhart says, by being created, the soul created God, for he did not exist until the soul was made. A little while since, and I declared, I am the cause that God is God. God is gotten of the soul, his Godhead he has of himself. God comes into being and passes away. Because all creatures declare him, God comes into being. While yet I abode in the ground and the depths of Godhead, in its flood and source, none asked me whither I went or what I did. None was there who could have questioned me. But when I flowed forth, all creatures declared God. And why did they not declare the Godhead? All that is in Godhead is one, and of that there is nothing to declare. Only God does. Godhead does nothing. There is nothing it can do, and never has it looked for anything to do. God and Godhead are as different as doing and non-doing. When I come home again in God, I do nothing more in myself. So this, my breaking through, is much more excellent than my first going out. For truly it is I who bring all creatures out of their own into my mind, and make them one in me. When I come back into the ground and the depths of Godhead, into its flood and source, none asks me whence I came or whither I went. None asks me. God passes away. In Jung, we see from these passages that Eckhart distinguishes between God and Godhead. Godhead is all, neither knowing nor possessing itself, whereas God is a function of soul, just as the soul is a function of Godhead. Godhead is obviously all all-pervading creative power, or in psychological terms, self-generating creative spirit, the Ouroboros, that neither knows nor possesses itself, comparable to Schopenhauer's universal will. But God appears as issuing forth from Godhead and the soul. Like every creature, the soul declares himself. The soul declares him. He exists insofar as the soul distinguishes itself from the unconscious and perceives its dynamis. And he ceases to exist as soon as the soul is immersed in the flood and source of unconscious dynamis. Thus, Eckhart says, when I flowed out from God, all things declared God is. Now this cannot make me blessed, for thereby I acknowledge myself a creature. But in my breaking through, I stand empty in the will of God, and empty also of God's will, and of all his works. even of God himself. Then I am more than all creatures. Then I am neither God nor creature. I am what I was, and that I shall remain, now and evermore. Then I receive a thrust which carries me above all angels. By this thrust, I become so rich that God cannot suffice me, despite all that he is as God and all his godly works. For in this breakthrough, I receive what God and I have in common. I am what I was. I neither increase nor diminish, for I am the unmoved mover that moves all things. Here God can find no more place in man, for man by his emptiness, for man by his emptiness has won back that which he eternally was and ever shall remain. The flowing out means a realization of the unconscious content and the unconscious dynamis in the form of an idea born of the soul. This is an act of conscious differentiation from the unconscious dynamis. This is this is an act of conscious differentiation. This is an act of conscious differentiation from the unconscious dynamis, a separation of the ego as subject from God or dynamis as object. By this act, God becomes. But when the breakthrough abolishes this separation by cutting the ego off from the world, and the ego again becomes identical with the unconscious dynamis, God disappears as an object and dwindles into a subject, which is no longer distinguishable from the ego. In other words, the ego, as a late product of differentiation, is reunited with the dynamic all oneness, the participation mystique of primitives. This is the immersion in the flood and source. The numerous analogies with Eastern ideas are immediately apparent, and they have been elaborated by writers more qualified than myself. In the absence of direct transmission, in the absence of direct transmission, this parallelism proves this parallelism proves that Eckhart was thinking from the depths of the collective psyche, which is common to East and West. This universal foundation, for which no common historical background can be made answerable, underlies the primitive mentality with its energetic conception of God. The return to primeval nature and mystic regression to the psychic conditions of prehistory are common to all religions, in which the impelling dynamis has not yet petrified into an abstract idea, but is still a living experience. No matter whether this be expressed in ceremonies of identification with the totem among the Australian Aborigines, or in the ecstasies of the Christian mystics. As a result of this retrograde process, the original state of identity with God is re-established, and a new potential is produced. However improbable such a state may be, it is a profoundly impressive experience which, by revivifying the individual's relation to God as an object, creates the world anew. One more page. In speaking of the relativity of the God symbol, we would be failing in our duty if we omitted to mention that solitary poet, whose tragic fate it was to find no relation either to his own times or to his own inner vision. Angelus Silesius, who was Johann Scheffler, a mystic and doctor, who lived from 1624 to 1677. What Eckhart labored to express with a great effort of thought, and often in barely intelligible language, Angelus Silesius sings in touchingly intimate verses, which portray the relativity of God with naive simplicity. His verses speak for themselves, and I quote, I know that without me, God can no moment live. Were I to die, then he no longer could survive. God cannot, without me, a single worm create. Did I not share with him, destruction were its fate. I am as great as God, and he is small like me. He cannot be above, nor I below him be. In me is God a fire, and I in him its glow. In common is our life, apart we cannot grow. God loves me more than self, my love doth give his weight. Whatever he gives to me, I must reciprocate. He is God and man to me, to him I'm both indeed. His thirst I satisfy, he helps me in my need. This God who feels for us is to us what we will, and woe to us if we our part do not fulfill. God is wherever he is. I am what I must be. If you know one, in sooth, you know both him and me. I am not outside God, nor leave I him afar. I am his grace and light, and he my guiding star. I am the vine which he doth plant and cherish most. The fruit which grows from me is God, the Holy Ghost. I am God's child, his son, and he too is my child. We are the two in one, both son and father mild. To illuminate my God, the sunshine I must be. My beams must radiate his calm and boundless sea. That was Angelus Silesius. And finally, from Jung, it would be absurd to suppose that such audacious ideas as these and Meister Eckhart's are nothing but figments of conscious speculation. Such thoughts are always profoundly significant historical phenomena, borne along on the unconscious currents of the collective psyche. Below the threshold of consciousness, thousands of other nameless ones are ranged behind them with similar thoughts and feelings, ready to open the gates of a new age. In these bold ideas, we hear the voice of the collective psyche, which with imperturbable assurance and the finality of a natural law brings about spiritual transformation and renewal. The unconscious currents reached the surface at the time of the Reformation. The Reformation largely did away with the church as the dispenser of salvation and established once more the personal relation to God. The culminating point in the objectification of the God concept had now been passed, and from then on it became more and more subjective. The logical consequence of this subjectifying process is a splitting up into sects, and its most extreme outcome is individualism, representing a new form of detachment from the world, the immediate danger of which is resubmersion in the unconscious dynamis. Arianism, the cult of the blonde beast, stems from this development, besides much else that distinguishes our age from others. But whenever this submersion in instinct occurs, it is compensated by a growing resistance to the chaos of sheer dynamism, by a need for form and order. Diving down into the maelstrom, the soul must create the symbol that captures and expresses this dynamism. It is this process in the collective psyche that is felt or intuited by poets and artists, whose main source of creativity is their perception of unconscious contents, and whose intellectual horizon is wide enough to discern the crucial problems of the age, or at least their outward aspects. It goes on in describing the nature of the uniting symbol further. What I mean, all of that sort of spoke for itself to a degree, but the relevance of it might not be clear. I mean, I'm hoping that in context it was clear. Um, yeah, the loss of the ego to the void, perspectively speaking, like if we take up the perspective of the void and share that and lose ourselves in it, we don't have to lose who we are. We lose something, but hopefully it's a stripping away of a burning away of what we no longer need. There's definitely still an open question of how. Like it's all very well to recommend having all these levels set up, but I think there is a key sort of situational awareness that is required. Situational awareness, if I'm getting that correctly, comes from the level of perspectival and participatory knowing, which is that like I have a feeling that the fate of I think we're in an ontological war, not just a war for this for the sake of what we call the human species. Because some environmentalists will sort of give you the story that like we're a cancer on the planet, and if we get kicked off, well, the world will just keep on in a happy way. And I don't think we have any evidence for that. I think we are sort of the consciousness organ of everything, and that there's a way that sort of everything is at stake. And I know that's a sort of risky narrative to be pushing, but it's like, well, everyone has their different stories. This is one of mine. I think that there is clearly a concrescence of consciousness which is occurring in our time, and it doesn't have to be at one particular moment for it to be noticed and participated in an ongoing way. And I think we need to be aware of and sort of exact and go with surf the wave of that process if we are to survive. Um, yeah, and I think there's a sort of Christian hangover shadow, which is like that our culture has to sacrifice itself in order to be worthy of redemption. And I don't think, much as I appreciate Jordan Hall's insights, I don't think that returning to the Catholic Church is for me, um, because they're not telling the right stories. And yeah, it's kind of intense, right? It's kind of like I can't exactly share with my grandma the story that unless we somehow exact the symbol forming function of humanity, then we're going to get kicked off the planet. But I mean, it it's not called the meta crisis for no reason. It's quite the situation. And so there's a way that I kind of want to get, we're going to need all the tools that we can have available, right? So I'm wanting to get our propositional, procedural, and perspectival forms of awareness all aligned in the right direction. And I want to get our Gnosticism and our Christianity and whoever else is along for the ride, the scientists, not that they're properly aware of what's going on, but I don't know, there's a very narrow, in a sense of like trying to narrow down a symbolic sense of what the third attractor to steer us between the Scylla and Charybdis of tyranny and catastrophe, decentralized catastrophe. what might that third attractive basin be? I think it's the sort of thing that can only be. I think it's a way of being, and I think it can only be demonstrated. I don't think it's not something that can be said. And so I'm actually sort of saying that it is literally by working out how to speak in a new way that I have an intuition is part of the way forwards. Um, and of course we have that analysis of like from Marvin Harris of like um, infrastructure, social structure, superstructure, and we need sort of like um, triage, transition, and long-term change on all three of those levels all at the same time. Um, and I'm definitely focusing here on the superstructural elements, dimension of that. And yeah, I mean, if there's ever a time for the higher versions of ourselves to show up and have something to contribute, like now is the time, really. Does it not seem that way? I mean, I know that there are. I don't want to be one of those prophets on the side of the road saying the end is nigh, like holding a sign, but like, and I'm ultimately saying that even just saying that would be a bad story. I'm saying that there is one story that has never been told. And so I've just expressed some of my beliefs, which we can reduce to propositions and truths, which are meaninglessness at the level of propositional tyranny, right? So all of this sharing was gesturing in a direction by attempting to demonstrate rather than by attempting to state explicitly. And I'm not very good at it yet. There's something that I'm not very good at yet, which I'm trying to get better at. And I think it requires facility with propositions. It requires facility with personhood. It requires facility with a perspectival immersion that is the product of groups and collective intelligence and distributed cognition. Um, but yeah, we also have to be willing to attune to and listen to the soul. And that is a collective process in the sense that I mean, I know that yeah, as John said, it's like a rather overwrought way for Jung to put it in the sense of the world soul, the anima mundi, but um, we are all facets of the one jewel, and through the natural aperture, which is our relationship with the daemon that we conceive, we are given access to transcendence, transformative experience, being able to transform the vehicle of humanity in mid-flight from sort of chitty chitty bang bang into whatever fighter jet we need to be to get through this ongoing moment. And there's so much change and so much momentum and so much rapidly happening that actually the capacity for transformation is like it's that capacity which we need to cling onto. And I think like being able to update our meta narrative, our a story of who we are and what we're up to and what this whole deal is. This meta narrative between the propositional and perspectival is given by the symbol forming function and by the soul. It's from that level. So for me, all of this hangs together pretty cleanly, but it may not be well articulated enough yet to have actually made any sense. But if there are at least threads that make sense, um, I'm not asking anyone. I don't want to identify with any groups, but I just feel that yeah, going back is necessary, but then inadequate as well. And we have to be deeply enough connected with the driving force of our own life that we can speak from that place. And at the very least, I'm hoping to have shown by direct quotation from the traditions around the world, not requiring signing up to Jung or to anyone else, that show that there is a clearly a direct connection between our capacity to move into our personhood and our capacity to open up to transcendence and to gnosis. And I'll make a jump which won't be quite clear, but I think it is by I think the greatest gift that we've been given is the logos, and because it's the divine power of speech by which we have transformed everything. Um, and I think, in a sense of taking what is most high and giving it to what is lowest, I think by sacrificing the logos to the void, and what would that mean? What would that look like? Yeah, I think that we can home ourselves in that. I think personhood is conferred by that, and I think that allows us to, in the sense of I am. What did he say? In the sense, I'm the way and the truth and the life. Um, the logos as the incarnation of Christ. Um, that's who we need to be. I mean, and not only him, there are plenty of other people that are worth being too. And I mean, did they not continue to live in and through us? Is that not the whole point of those traditions, including the ones that were repressed by the church? It's not possible to see anything, but it looks very beautiful out there. And I hope we keep getting to be here in silence or in noise.